on a massive scale. And this means that we need serious government action. So we need the government to be on our side, to push for policies that will help this transition to be more at a massive scale, and basically to help create like millions of jobs and help us stop and adapt to like the climate crisis.
So I'm sure you guys have heard mention of at least the Green New Deal, and that's a big thing that Sunrise is pushing. Sunrise came out with Representative AOC and Senator McKee and Senator Sanders with the Green New Deal resolution. And essentially what the Green New Deal calls for is, if you guys learned in your history class or anything like that in high school about FDR and his New Deal program, is essentially a series of programs and federal incentives and providing federal guaranteed jobs to build infrastructure around the country. A lot of the bridges you see now, a lot of the monuments you see, a lot of the national parks you see were built during this New Deal period. And essentially what Sunrise believes and what some of the, I guess, the presidential candidates believe is essentially recreating that and having the federal government essentially do the same thing, except with renewable energy and green infrastructure and like weatherizing like houses and schools and all that, kind of like what I was talking about with energy efficiency, and doing all of that, and essentially provide millions of good jobs. And what it also calls for is like a just transition. So what that essentially means is like we can't just disregard everybody that's been a part of the fossil fuel industry. Like people rely on those jobs. Like people need to feed their families. We can't just kick people out of those jobs without like a backup plan. So really having job training for everyone that was a part of the fossil fuel industry here in the United States, essentially be able to easily shift over to a green economy job. And that's a big part of the Green New Deal. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of parts of the Green New Deal. But. So if we want to talk about kind of the influence that money has had on our political system, I'm sure you could all agree that money, unfortunately, does play a huge factor in American politics, which is unfortunate. It really is. And what we used to see is, if you flash back, like 30 years ago or whatever, or 20 years ago, I suppose, like conservatives and liberals both agreed that climate change was an issue. And an issue that we had to tackle together as Americans, because it would affect all of us. And unfortunately now you obviously see the very partisan divide with right wing largely denying climate change, while obviously left wing fully embracing it. And a big reason why that happened was the unfortunate introduction of dirty money into one of the parties. We saw people like the Koch brothers, which is a conservative group that has a lot of money, inject that money into electing officials or persuading officials to deny climate change so that oil companies and the fossil fuel industry could keep profiting off of the damages it's going to cause. And I don't know if we've already passed through it yet or not, but these companies have acknowledged and known the effects of what they were doing for a long time now, but just decided to keep it hidden for obvious reasons. And that goes along with what I was kind of just saying about like deceiving the people. Unfortunately, these companies have known this. They've done their own studies, and they've determined that, yes, this is having an effect on our atmosphere. Yes, burning of fossil fuels, CO2, the introduction of methane from the agricultural sector is having an effect. And it's simply just a simple science experiment, really. Like I like to put it, like if you just put some CO2 and methane in a glass jar and sealed it up and added some sunlight, and then yeah, it will heat up more than just normal levels of air. Like it will be hotter. That's really all it is. And sure, there's a lot more cycles and stuff happening in the Earth, and there's like forests taking the CO2 and expel oxygen and all that, but it's not the simple introduction. It real quick is simply what we've done as humanity is introduced fossil fuels into our atmosphere that weren't normally there for the past millennia or so. At some point, they were part of our atmosphere, but that was back when there was dinosaurs. So we're essentially recreating that atmosphere, and we have no idea what effects they'll have on our current human society. Because all of it's been buried, stays in the ground, sits there. It's been there for a long time now, and now we're digging all that up, reintroducing it into our atmosphere, which is having all the effects we're seeing now. And to say that that wouldn't have an effect is absolutely crazy.
So next we're going to look at some examples from ExxonMobil, which is one of the largest private oil companies. Does anyone want to read out these quotes first? Just this first one?
Okay.
From 1978, ExxonMobil internal documents. Man has a time window of 5 to 10 years before the need for hard decisions regarding changes in energy strategies might become critical.
ExxonMobil is the number 2 importer, I forgot which one, I'm sorry, of the United States. So essentially like the second biggest country in the company in the country. And I'm sure you all heard about the oil spills and everything related to Exxon.
So just like keep this in mind, this was in 1978, so like they knew at the time.
Yeah.
Would anyone else like to read the second one?
Thank you.
CEO Lee Raymond arguing against Kyoto Protocol in 1997. There's a lot we really don't know about how climate will change in the 21st century and beyond. We need to understand the issue better, and fortunately we have time. It is highly unlikely that the temperature in the middle of the next century will be significantly affected whether policies are enacted now or 20 years from now.
So the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 was this kind of, well, in reality, not that much was done, but it was a big discussion between countries around the globe about what should we be doing and how do we go about that. Did that really happen? Obviously not, because here we are in 2019, still talking about the same stuff. Well, a lot of the countries still in the same place. What should we do? And we need to be a lot farther along than that in 2019, when we have 11 years before those feedback loops I spoke about kick in around the world. And feedback loops, in short, I know this isn't a science lecture or whatever, but basically it's the idea, or here's an easy feedback loop. Ice melt means less reflective material shooting the radiation back into space. So the less reflective material there is, the less solar radiation will be going back into space and the more retained. And another feedback loop, the ice buried underneath the white ice that you see, like on pictures and all that, is actually black ice. It's dark, it's been buried, it's black. And it has like stuff in it that makes it black. I don't exactly know why. But like that retains more heat. It draws heat in. As you all know, wearing black on a hot summer day will make you hotter than wearing a white t-shirt. It's the same factor. And if we want to continue with the positive feedback loops, the more, just in the Arctic or whatever, the more water that is melting off these, or melting on the surface or whatever, means the more melt that occurs. Just like if you go outside and you take a hose on top of snow or whatever, it's gonna melt. Rather than if it didn't have that water on top or below. So it's really, rivers are basically forming, cutting our Arctic and Antarctic like in pieces and chunks, which then is having them break off more and more. And that's just talking about the Arctic. There's feedback loops around the globe that will kick in. Like if you just want to talk about well, never mind. There's lots of things, but we'll continue.
So the last quote is that they deflected their responsibility. Would anyone like to read the last one?
One more. It's the last one.
Andrew Warren, British campaigner, quoted 2005. Raymond is no longer seeking to deny the science behind climate change. Instead, he simply predicts an endless rise in the demand for the fossil fuel his company sells, and maintains that there is nothing that can be done to alter that.
So again, companies either deflecting responsibility, hiding the facts, or just plain out lying.
So they knew, they denied, and then they deflected this responsibility.
And again, that's kind of like we already kind of covered that. Yeah, spending in the 2016 election, I mean, look, I mean, lots of spending across the board. We can acknowledge in the United States that money does play a factor in our politics. I mean, I kind of already talked about that, but you just want to look at spending. Democratic Party, Republican Party, and then here's the Koch brothers I mentioned, which is basically a whole other third party here, except they're not a party. They're two brothers, one passed away now, but that have a crap ton of money, and they inject it into the Republican Party to kind of deny climate change because they're making all their money from the oil industry.
I'd also like to point out, though, that it's not just the Republican Party that is accepting money from these fossil fuel industries, it's also the Democrats, so like that's why we push a lot to try to mobilize like a lot of our Democratic representatives to like support us and like move over to be more to stand with us for climate justice. So our last thing that they do is consolidate power within the government, which we kind of spoke about. But like one example that I guess I could give is like in Rhode Island specifically, Gina Raimondo, who's our state governor, she's known to like accept like hundreds and thousands of dollars from these fossil fuel industries like every year. And there was a report that came out before the LNG facility that she wanted to pass that said that it would be detrimental for the people who are living around there for their health. So she kind of like disregarded that, and the people that she's appointed on the board that reviews those reports were also like supportive of her and also received money from this fossil fuel industry. So it's like pretty easy to see how like this has influence on like not just at the federal level but also like on the state level. One thing that I'd also like to touch upon is how like environmental racism occurs. So as you can see, like 56% of the population near toxic waste sites are people of color, and like 95% of their claims against polluters are denied by the EPA. There's 38% higher nitrogen dioxide exposure where they live, and they're 2 times more likely to live without like clean water or modern sanitation. Just to kind of continue with my example of Rhode Island, so like one of our main sites where the most pollution is like emitted into the air is like near one of our hospitals, which is kind of like weird that it would be next to the hospital, but also around this area. It's in South Providence, which is known to have a lot of low-income minority families that live around there because it's so cheap to live around there, and it's usually cheap across the nation to live in areas like next to the highway where you're going to be exposed to more like particles in the air released from the gas from the cars. So it's pretty prevalent that like that there is a lot of environmental racism that goes hand in hand with this.
In the state of Connecticut, I'm sure some of you might have heard about this current battle right now, but the state of Connecticut's trying to build another fossil fuel plant in Killingly, which is northeast side of the state. Probably maybe like an hour or something from here, not too sure. But Killingly is a fairly poor area, community, and the town wants the money of allowing a fossil fuel plant to come in and build another fossil fuel gas plant, I believe it is. When in reality, we don't even need that plant. There's a lot of, in the state of Connecticut, like we've been focusing on this like throughout, like I'm part of a lot of nonprofits in the state. And we've been focusing on like energy efficiency, as I spoke about, like why our energy prices are too much and all that. And we've prevented in the past, I think it's a decade alone, 2 to 3, well, at least 2, but roughly 3, of needing 3 more power plants simply through conserving energy through energy efficiency programs. Like there's this thing called the Conservation and Load Management Plan, which directly every energy bill paid, like a tiny portion of that goes back to like the state of Connecticut to literally just give money to companies and stuff like that to help low-income communities try and pay for energy efficiency upgrades. So like even things like solar panels, but largely like insulation and energy efficient appliances like fridges and all that actually draw a crap ton of energy, which reduces both the ratepayer, so whoever's paying the bills, it reduces their energy costs. They pay less, and it's saving energy. No matter if it's coming from clean energy or fossil fuels, somehow energy is being saved. So we've been kind of focusing on that, and there's a huge battle right now with the governor and everything over this new power plant that's being built in Killingly. And there's also one, I believe, just built in New Haven, or is it New London? Is it here? Do you guys know? Never mind. But unfortunately, we kind of lost that, and there's not too much more we can do because
Most of the people in this room are new to New London.
Oh yeah, that's right. You guys are freshmen. That's awesome. But yeah, so yeah, it's kind of taking advantage of poor communities or communities of color or minorities.
Yeah. And
and
it
we-
will continue to
yeah.
happen, like, because the people who are most affected by climate change are people who are like on frontline communities and people who are low income and like live in these areas.
So not just the effects, or not that they've just been taken advantage of, but also the effects of climate change. Because if you don't have money, how are you going to run away from the effects of climate change? You can't. If you lose your house to a flood, you're screwed.
One of the things that strikes me, because I study mobilization, is that this is also a problem of being able
Yes.
to mobilize a community,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Is that the poorer the community, the harder it is for that community to have the resources, meaning even just time resources, to get together, to attend meetings with their representatives, right? I mean, we have a lot of single parents, we have a lot of, people working 2 jobs. I mean, mobilization is something that actually requires actual time resources. You have to be willing and able and capable of giving your time specifically to mobilize and to put pressure on your elected representatives at every level. And poor communities often don't have that option, right? So there's also a political issue, right? That,
100%.
a wealthy community mobilizes every time there's some sort of, new factory coming in, or rehabilitation center for drug addicts. We don't want them in our neighborhood, right? It's going to bring our prices down, etc. But these types of communities don't have, they just don't have that type of access, and they don't have that type of mobilization capacity to connect to their politicians.
100%.
And Sunrise recognizes that, and that's why we always try to, like, wherever we have our hubs, we try to make sure that, I'm gonna dive into it more but later on, but like the people's alignment is to make sure that we're really reaching out to like who the community is around us and making our meetings accessible so that we are more like inclusive group, so that we're able to really reflect the community.
It's tough. That's always been a tough thing
Yeah.
for the environmental community at large to do. Is because when you have people that are that need to go to work to even put food on the table that night, they can't go to a protest. They can't go speak to the legislators. They can't take time to even hear about what you're saying. They can't take time to think about climate change that might affect them 10 years from now, that maybe isn't their primary issue. Right now, they're just thinking about putting food on the table this evening, or paying for a bill for their kid to go to school, or paying their taxes, or paying their mortgage. A lot of times you can't really afford to think about like what effect sea level rise might come, even if you're living next to the ocean. That's you got 2 years, 3 years to worry about it. You got to think about putting that food on the table first, and that's why it's up to everyone to realize this is an issue, and we all need to work together, and we all need to make sure that everyone knows just how important this is. Because even putting that food on our table, those food bills are going to get more expensive when our agriculture starts to fail. We're already seeing prices go up in certain products. Even think about I'm not sure if this will happen or not, but I haven't heard about it in a while, but we could lose coffee due to climate change. Just imagine crazy things like that. It seems crazy. It really does. It's lose coffee. What are you talking about? But
Yeah.
How will college students survive?
Yeah, how you guys get by? You're just freshmen. What if you lose coffee 2 years from now?
Yeah.
Junior and senior year, no coffee. Drop out of school.
Another issue also that we see in the movement with environmental racism is the fact that these communities are also the ones who are a lot of them don't really have access to this information, so they don't even know that they're the ones being directly affected. So something that Sunrise really tries to do is make sure that the communities that are being affected, nearby us, are aware of this, and that we're able to get the word out so that they know what's happening and we can mobilize them. So what are we going to do about this? Our plan to win. Basically, we have a theory of change, and this is made up of 3 parts. Would anyone like to read the first one?
Maybe someone on this side of the room?
Yeah, someone on this side of the room.
I'm happy to read.
Okay.
So, people power. Build an army of young people that has the ability to mobilize millions.
So this is like reaching out to students, so like us coming to present to you guys, having one-on-ones, making community partnerships, but also like by having like big actions where we can like get the attention of the public to sort of mobilize more people to join us, to be like, hey, what's Sunrise? And then they can look us up or like join us at our like pursuing like actions.
Yeah, so I mean, the people power really is the idea of having, kind of the idea of having eventually, what's our numbers? 3-point-something million people?
3.8 million.
3.8 million people in the United States essentially being part of not necessarily Sunrise's movement, but the climate movement at large, and having those people care. Because statistically, that means if you have 3.8 million people, it can't be ignored. That's enough of the population to have this be a priority issue, be an issue that will be solved. And looking at movements like all the civil rights movements we've seen in the past and studying those, that's how many people they require to get the actions that they want to see done. So essentially we're trying to replicate and study from the past so we can move forward to the future.
So political power. Does anyone want to read about political power? Yes.
Elect a critical mass of enthusiastically supportive public officials who are ready to fight for our generation.
Yeah, so this is like basically voting out the corrupt elected officials and bringing in the real leaders who will align with us and stand with us. And we also build political power by changing the stances of elected officials through public pressure. So like taking over the state house like we've done, or like taking over Nancy Pelosi's office to try to like give them public pressure to like.
Yeah. Sunrise's actions a lot of the time are the ones that have got those headlines that even made Sunrise like a thing that people know about, is those kind of more kind of up your face like actions that Sunrise has taken, like Speaker Pelosi's office or Senator Dianne Feinstein from California, where she was telling these kids like, hey, I've been doing this for 30 years, you don't know what you're talking about. It's like these are little kids, 10 years old, like whatever, that are saying like, hey, I'm worried about my future. Like how like that type like that's a moment that Sunrise got to capture that helped propel like hey, like this is an issue, and these are what our politicians are saying. Like when the scientists are saying that we only have at that time it was 12 years to really see the changes that are needed, and this is what our politicians are saying. Aren't they supposed to be reflective of the people? And if we look at national statistics, it's somewhere near 70% of people that support the idea of the Green New Deal, which is crazy high. So really the holdouts are our politicians and that dirty money that we talked about.
And lastly, building the people's alignment. So does anyone want to read this last one? Yes.
A group of political and social movements that would advance a shared agenda for society, united for the dignity and well-being of all people that will.
Well, essentially what this one's talking about is kind of just having, like, so Sunrise is an environmental movement at its core, but in reality, this movement is kind of a movement of just making the world a better place. And we kind of want to connect with as many movements that can do that as possible. If it's not an environmental movement, it doesn't matter. It's still an issue that Sunrise cares about. So it's a civil rights movement, it's a climate change movement, it's a movement just for a brighter future.
Yeah. So like an example, like Sunrise RI, yesterday there's this group called Never Again, which is like a national movement, but the hub in Rhode Island, Sunrise RI was supporting them by showing up to the state house to basically push for Gina Raimondo, our state governor, to like not support privatized prisons, because there's the Wyatt Detention Center in a town called Central Falls that was turned into like an ICE prison. So like we all kind of like mobilized there to try to push her to like not support these private prisons, and she ended up saying yes, that she would not support these private prisons, which was like amazing. So we were planning to take over for like 5 days. I think she was a little scared of that, but yeah.
So yeah, we've kind of touched on this already, but the Green New Deal, essentially what it is it's this idea, a concept, a theory, to kind of do what I talked about with FDR's kind of New Deal program and kind of re-implement it, make it a green new economy type Green New Deal. And it's a set of policies that'll transform our economy and scale, needed to stop the climate crisis.
So now we're just going to show you guys a video. This was narrated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and it's basically going to summarize like the Green New Deal.
Yeah, kind of the future we're hoping for,
Yeah, exactly.
that we want to see.
Ah, the bullet train from New York to DC. It always brings me back to when I first started making this commute. In 2019, I was a freshman in the most diverse Congress in history. Up to that point, it was a critical time. I'll never forget the children in our community. They were so inspired to see this new class of politicians who reflected them navigating the halls of power. It's often said, you can't be what you can't see. And for the first time, they saw themselves. I think there was something similar with the Green New Deal. We knew that we needed to save the planet and that we had all the technology to do it, but people were scared. They said it was too big, too fast, not practical. I think that's because they just couldn't picture it yet. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with how we got here. 1977, New York. A senior scientist named James Black made a presentation about how burning fossil fuels could eventually lead to global temperatures rising 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 2 years, one of the world's biggest supertankers was outfitted with a state-of-the-art lab to measure CO2 in the ocean, gathering more data about global warming. Guess who was doing all of this research? ExxonMobil, the oil and gas company. Oh yeah, Exxon knew this whole time, as did our politicians. 10 years later, James Hansen, NASA's top climate scientist, told Congress he was 99% certain that global warming was happening and caused by humans. That was 1988, the year before I was even born. So did Exxon listen to the science, including their own? Did they change business models, invest in renewables? No, the opposite. They knew and they doubled down. They and others spent millions setting up a network of lobby groups and think tanks to create doubt and denial about climate change. It was an effort designed to attack and dispute the very kind of science they themselves had been doing. And it worked. Politicians went to bat for fossil fuels, and these massive corporations kept digging and mining, drilling and fracking like there was no tomorrow. America became the biggest producer and consumer of oil in the world. Fossil fuel companies made hundreds of billions, while the public paid the lion's share to clean up their disasters. We lost a generation of time we'll never get back. Entire species will never get back. Natural wonders gone forever. And in 2017, Hurricane Maria destroyed the place where my family was from, Puerto Rico. It was like a climate bomb. It took as many American lives as 9/11. And in the next year, when I was elected to Congress, the world's leading climate scientists declared another emergency. They told us that we had 12 years left to cut our emissions in half, or hundreds of millions of people would be more likely to face food and water shortages, poverty, and death. 12 years to change everything. How we got around, how we fed ourselves, how we made our stuff, how we lived and worked, everything. The only way to do it was to transform our economy, which we already knew was broken, since the vast majority of wealth was going to just a small handful of people, and most folks were falling further and further behind. It was a true turning point. Lots of people gave up. They said we were doomed. But some of us remembered that as a nation, we'd been in peril before. The Great Depression, World War II. We knew from our history how to pull together to overcome impossible odds. And at the very least, we owed it to our children to try. The wave began when Democrats took back the House in 2018, and then the Senate and the White House in 2020, and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing for the fence ambition we needed. Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind. That included Medicare for All, the most popular social program in American history. We also introduced the federal jobs guarantee, a public option including dignified living wages for work. Funnily enough, the biggest problem in those early years was a labor shortage. We were building a national smart grid, retrofitting every building in America, putting trains like this one all across the country. We needed more workers. That group of kids from my neighborhood were right in the middle of it all, especially this one girl, Ileana. Her first job out of college was with AmeriCorps Climate, restoring wetlands and bayous in coastal Louisiana. Most of her friends.
So that's kind of the gist of that video. Yeah, so one thing that AOC, she's obviously a Democrat. So one thing that she touches on is obviously like Democrats taking back the House and all that. And kind of that's the most realistic scenario we have. But like I'm for one that's like hoping that all of a sudden there'll be like a turnaround in terms of politics, that this is no longer a partisan issue, but right now it still is. And yeah, so we are running out of time. We wanted to have a few minutes for Q&A. But real quick, touching on kind of the Sunrise Movement here in the state of Connecticut. So this will be our last day of action. The major one that I'm sure you all saw was September 20th. Millions of people around the globe marched out of schools, marched out of their jobs, went to their capitals. Every capital in the United States had a group of people there protesting for climate action. Every capital and well, just about every city around the globe also had the same. It was an international day of action that saw the most people on the streets fighting for environmental issues for the first time since the first Earth Day, which was back in
1980.
Over there, so a while ago. So this was a big deal. But this wasn't the first time. There's been other smaller strikes. But this was the first time where essentially the international community said, this is the day we're going to say what we want. So September 20th in Hartford, what we talked about was the need for a Green New Deal. We talked about immigration, we talked about transportation, the need for public transit, clean renewable energy, union involvement, energy efficiency, war and warming, and simply the need for action. And these are just some pictures and stuff like that. We did an 11-minute die-in. We were supposed to do it inside the Capitol, but the Capitol Police told us that we're going to arrest you if you do that, and we didn't discuss that. So we were like, okay, I guess we'll do the die-in outside. So we had a die-in, which is essentially where we all just like laid down and kind of reflected for 11 minutes or so, pretending to die because of the climate crisis. And then we delivered a resolution as well as many petitions to the governor's office demanding action be taken. Myself, if you want to jump a few just for a second. We asked about a few things this day, but essentially we called for a Green New Deal for the state of Connecticut. That means Governor Blunt declare a climate emergency for the state of Connecticut, joining alongside some of the other states that have done so, alongside Boston, alongside New York City, alongside the whole country of the United Kingdom, and a few other countries as well that have declared a climate emergency and said we need to mobilize to get this done. So that was one of our asks for the governor. We're also hoping to end climate emissions by 2030, which is a pretty ambitious goal, but that's what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says needs to be done. Right now, the state of Connecticut and the governor just released kind of a goal to do so by 2040, which is good, but still we're trying to push as much as we can. Energy efficiency programs and return funds that keep getting rated to fill a general budget gap in the state of Connecticut rather than go into programs that would actually help low-income communities. Divesting from fossil fuels, don't build that plant in Killingly that I talked about. Call a special session for emergency climate legislation. And one major thing that kind of hits home with me is climate change education. like I'm a student at Eastern and stuff, and a lot of people have no idea what like climate change is. They know, okay, icebergs are melting, polar bears are dying, and that's the limited scope of knowledge, which is unfortunate because this is something that's going to affect all of us, and I truly believe this is the issue of our generation. So that's one thing that's needed. And like when we have representatives in the state of Connecticut pushing that climate change is banned to even be discussed in public education, to ban people like us from even talking about climate change, from even having it be discussed in classes, is absolutely insane to me. That's my representative, John Piscopo, if you ever heard of him. But we formed this organization in the state of Connecticut that's made out of 91 plus organizations. I'm on the executive board for the Connecticut Climate Crisis Mobilization Coalition. And it's really all the traditional environment groups. It's all the new groups like Sunrise and the youth groups. It's a lot of labor unions. It's a lot of religious groups, and we all came together on September 20th, calling for climate action in the state of Connecticut. And kind of final point I want to make is right now we have a lot of momentum. Connecticut has a lot of momentum. Rhode Island has a lot of momentum. The United States has a lot of momentum and a lot of push, and we got to make sure that momentum does not fall. We need to keep that up. We can't say like, okay, so September 20th, we did good. We had a lot of people on the streets. We had millions of people around the globe. Cool, maybe something gets done. No, we need to keep that pressure up because simply I wish this was an issue that didn't need that pressure, but when we only have 11 years to prevent 1.5 degree increase of warming and all those positive feedback loops from kicking in, this is something that needs to be done. I mean, it sounds crazy, but sometimes the most scariest things that could happen are what hits home most. What could happen by the year 2100 is the Atlantic, or the Gulf Stream that flows from up north down to Mexico, that could completely stop. Our oceans could stop flowing like they normally do, which is absolutely crazy. So yeah, here's just our social media and stuff like that if you guys want to add us. And if you want to be signed up for like our emails from Sunrise Connecticut, that's a little link to that. But we kind of want to open it up to like Q&A and stuff.
Well, we only have a few minutes.
Yeah,
so
5 minutes.
If you know that you're not going to be able to join for lunch, I'll maybe prioritize a couple of questions. We'll ask the question, because I don't think we have time for more than a couple of questions. So, Jack, let's take a couple.
Yeah. One thing about the Green New Deal that I think it gets a lot of flack for is that it's such a massive change in the U.S. economy. Estimates have put like the cost over 10 years somewhere between $50 and $90 trillion. And so with Warren and Sanders, their plans for Medicare for all that they say will cost $34 trillion, already getting a whole bunch of flack because they're going to have to raise taxes on the middle class. How do you pay for something like the Green New Deal?
That's a good point. Okay.
Can you just hold it? We'll catch 2 questions,
Okay.
and then we get we have a second question. Okay. No? What? Oh, Lisa, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, right now? So I was wondering, like, how do you think these initiatives will affect, like, the presidential elections?
Okay.
Okay, 2
So
really big questions and
go
really
hand
good
in hand.
questions. Give it a couple of minutes each.
Okay. Sure. So that's a really good question. It is going to cost a crap ton of money. Of course it is. Lots of things do. But what we are hoping to achieve essentially is the same level of mobilization and industry that we had during World War II. Because this is another crisis. World War II was a crisis. It was an existential crisis. The United States is threatened. Here we are in the same boat. Sure, we don't have Nazis and everything happening, but the equivalent effects of is there. And essentially, we need to have that same level of worriedness, I guess you'd say, about this issue. Because it will cost trillions of dollars, and it will cost a lot of money. Of course it will. And it will take a lot of effort, and it will take some time. But I refuse to believe it's something that can't be done, because, I mean, it would be the same level of mobilization we had with the with the FDR's New Deal, and the same thing we had during World War II. And I think as a country that is the richest country in the world, with I believe the best people in the world, with the best equipment and smarts and skills, I think it's something that the United States can do and should lead the world in doing. And I know obviously not everyone agrees, and the amount of money it costs is absolutely tiny when compared to the amount of lost productivity that will be caused because of climate change, which is something almost impossible to measure. But when we're talking about all the money that will have to go into simply trying to prevent New York City from going underwater, to prevent Florida from going underwater, to build these seawalls, to try to do even any of that, which isn't even guaranteed to work, and all the money to try and figure out how we're gonna even survive in a means that we currently have, in a standard of living that we currently have, just to protect all of that, I think it's worth it. I mean, I don't think you can even put a factor of money on this when you're thinking about something this big. When we're thinking about, by even a tiny chance, even a 1% chance or 2% chance of like our ocean currents to stop flowing, like I'd say that the money shouldn't even be a factor. We have to stop that. Like the effects of that would be absolutely strong, like crazy. Like right now we're in the midst of an early stage of a 6 mass extinction. We lose 200 species every day. And simply through that biodiversity loss, we don't even really know how to measure those effects of what will happen, because that's a feedback loop. We lose all the small species, we lose species that we don't even care about, we don't even know about. They'll have devastating effects on just our agricultural systems, just how we live as a society. We like to think we're kind of disconnected from nature, but we still are connected and we still rely on it. But, so yeah, it'll cost a lot of money, and sure, some taxes might go up on the middle class, but the end game is still costs will go down. Even though visibly costs will go up, the perceived, what it would cost won't happen. So it's a lesser of two evils. But.
Now to answer your question, could you repeat your question?
How these initiatives will affect the results of the 2020 election?
So one of our goals, since like one of our main goals is to mobilize a lot of young people, we're hoping that like we can increase like the voter turnout for the young people. And we specifically like haven't come out with like a specific president that we're like behind, but basically we support any of the candidates that are aligned with what we believe in. So like ones who believe in a just future, and taking action on the climate crisis, support the Green New Deal, and advocate for like everything that the Green New Deal advocates for.
Yeah. So kind of the effect, I mean, whoever wins the presidential election will have a very strong say in what happens in our future. So it is critically important that someone is elected that cares about climate change. And Sunrise, I don't know if it's released yet, but is working on a like Sunrise scoring sheet.
Yes, it has
of
been released.
It has been released.
Yes.
I haven't taken a look at it yet, but the scoring sheet of which campaigns seem like they're more aligned with what we believe. And yeah,
So that's just
but
basically-
whoever's elected can basically enact a Green New Deal or not. And obviously we believe that we need someone who will immediately.
Okay, I hope some of you will be able to join us, and if you have more questions, which I know you do, bring them with you. We're going to, yes, let's please thank Jenni and Mitchell for coming today. Do you know what the quiet room is? And well, we used to call it the quiet room in my time. The room that is to the right of Harris when you go in.
Antisocial room.
The antisocial room? No, it's the room where you actually have long tables. So maybe
Thank you.
meet us all there.
Thank you for having us, guys. Again, any of our socials or anything up here, or if you have any questions, you can come to us.
Time crunch.